Greetings, everyone. So this particular lecture is an extension of Dr. Shanman's lecture that he conducted in week 2. This is a natural extension of the information that he shared on the differences between functional behavior assessments and functional analyses. We're going to focus on some of the integral parts of a functional behavior assessment and those parts that are more descriptive in nature, meaning we don't necessarily have an experiment where we're manipulating various aspects of the conditions. We're simply describing them as they occur. And as he probably alluded to or directly addressed in his presentation, it's different when you're not manipulating the environment. You're basically just recording what you see, and then you're having to summarize and collect data, hypothesize based on what you're seeing rather than what you're manipulating. And that, of course, flies in the face a little bit of good sound scientific practices because you're not able to eliminate other extraneous variables. With that said, I think there are parts of the generic FBA process that's actually really important, and some of those parts we're going to use and you're going to use for the rest of your careers. I think when you think about FBAs, you should think about a continuum where we have some indirect and direct measures, as well as a full-fledged FA. So part of your takeaway from this particular lecture is understanding that the FBA is a continuum, and that on the lower end, we're basically talking about interviews, surveys, then maybe some observations, ABC data, all the way up to full-fledged manipulations of the environment so we can isolate functions more scientifically. So a continuum. Some of these slides we're going to skip over. I don't think they're necessarily relevant in all of these cases. Basically, when we're talking about an FBA, we're talking about a problem-solving process. And there may be a variation of techniques and strategies that are used within that problem-solving process. What we're looking for is really the function of the behavior. Sometimes you're going to see words like cause. Actually, don't think that that word is the best choice. One of the reasons why is really because we are always seeking the function, and the function is going to be malleable over time depending on the conditions. Cause seems a lot more cemented. X caused Y, and then that's it. We're looking to determine what is maintaining behavior over time. And that seems like a much more achievable goal than trying to report something that people discuss in terms of a cause. And then depending on where you're providing services, whether it's clinically, in a home, in a school, generally speaking, we are working with problem-solving teams. Those teams select interventions that address the problem behavior or challenging behavior. With that said, I think that it's important to inform those teams with the right information. Even though the FBA is comprised of some variations of processes, what is very important about the process is that it's systematic in nature. And the more scientific it is, then we want to make that puts us in a place where we can be more confident. We can make more reliable assertions from that information. What we're looking for is what ends up contributing to the occurrence and the maintenance of the problem behavior. And then, of course, using that information as a basis to develop what we're going to do to prevent this from happening and what we're going to do if it happens. So proactive and reactive. And together that should form a fairly comprehensive plan. When we think of why this is so important in our fields and in similar fields, we really can easily get caught up in what everyone sees. So the topography of what the behavior looks like. That's what people want to talk about. That's what lay people want to focus on. That's only going to give us part of the equation. And I'm not so sure that that gives you enough. In fact, I know it doesn't give you enough. It may give you enough to lead you in the wrong direction. So what we're looking at is the function, what the individual gets out of those consequences, whether that means they're obtaining something, receiving reinforcement, or able to escape or avoid something. Regardless, the source is always attached to reinforcement, because without reinforcement, you wouldn't see the behavior to start off with. And again, to tie these pieces in, sometimes behaviors may look alike or sound alike, but the functions can be quite different. And sometimes behaviors cannot look or sound alike at all, and the functions could also be the same. Generally speaking, especially in school settings, we're looking at a total team approach to conducting an FBA. Sometimes the social worker, the school psychologist, counselors, the teachers, all of these individuals are contributing as a whole to the assessment process. In most clinical settings, we may have, of course, a licensed behavior analyst involved, possibly a line tech, a senior behavior analyst involved, and we may be asking the family to collect some data separate and apart from that. But nonetheless, there's typically more than just one person involved in the process. I would say that it's more of a team when you're working in a school setting, because according to IDEA and some of the laws governing how we deal with disabilities in schools, it requires this multidisciplinary team. That can be problematic because not everyone on the team would be using the principles of behavior to drive what they're doing within the FBA, nor would they necessarily have any of the training, education, and experience to do that with fidelity when you compare the education, training, and experience to a behavior analyst. Again, they bring other skills to the table, but I think there's some challenges that occur in the school settings that we have to be aware of, and we have to rise above, so to speak, figure out a way to deal with them. This is kind of what I just explained. In Louisiana, we have something called the School Building Level Committee, and that committee is one of the initial committees that would come in contact with the possible FBA process for an individual. 9 times out of 10, however, it's going to be the IEP committee. That is the committee that individuals would have surrounding their case once the SBOC committee has actually determined that the child qualifies for special education services. So that SBLC committee is typically responsible for new referrals of problem behaviors, and as well as individuals who are receiving individualized accommodation plans through Section 504 of the Individuals with Disabilities Act. Those are things that you may have learned as an undergrad through your experiences working with people in schools or as a special ed teacher. If you want more information on that, please don't hesitate to reach out. All right, and again, to reiterate, because especially in the school setting, we are drawing from multiple disciplines, there doesn't appear to be one specific technique. However, I would say that better FBAs that are done more systematically, when you look at them from 35,000 feet, you will see a specific set of considerations you're taking on board when you're engaging in this process. Now, there's a variety of things you do within the generic FBA, and I think that's what we're going to talk about in this lecture. So whenever someone is behaving, and it's behavior that gets our attention in all the wrong ways, so to speak, what it looks like is called the topography. I think that you guys are quite aware of that. And what we do find is that what it looks like in and of itself really doesn't give us what we need in order to determine what the most effective interventions are going to be. Some may have argued that before you decide to reduce a problem behavior, you have to identify its alternatives, what you want the person to do as a desired behavior or as a behavior that would be habilitative for them. And you want to determine what those are prior to engaging in the FBA, because we want to know what the targets are for this individual to hit, rather than just looking at reduction. If we keep focusing on reduction, then we're going to end up with a person that does nothing. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be doing what they need to do. In addition to that, if we reinforce individuals for what the desired or habilitative behaviors are, then we could find other options for them to contact reinforcement. And in many cases, those behaviors are incompatible with the problem behavior that we're focusing on. So I think one thing that's always helpful to me is illustrating things via a graphic. And I tend to draw these types of things whenever I'm working on a problem. And so this pathway, I think, is really important, because what it does is it yields us all of the different features of the equation that we may have to intervene with. So typically we would have some type of setting event. I do not like the word trigger, and please make me explain if I haven't done so already, but there's typically an apparent antecedent event that seems to evoke the problem behavior, and then we have the consequence that is generally associated with maintaining that behavior over time. So how does it work for the individual? All right, so to kind of unpack these a little bit further, what's the context that the behavior is occurring in? What happens immediately before it? What would the desired behavior be? But what is an acceptable alternative? That's really important to be able to determine, because when we're actually trying to shape a behavior and we look at successive approximation to that behavior, we may not be able to get to that desired behavior right away. So we need to know what's going to be more acceptable, still contacting reinforcement, but it's going to be the gateway behavior to get us to the desired behavior. And then we have to identify what are those consequences going to be. Will the desired behavior result in some very predictable, powerful consequences? And what's going to happen with each of these? What's currently happening right now, and what will happen if the alternative behavior starts being emitted on a regular basis? And again, that drives what ends up happening with your behavior intervention plan. In the pathway, once we've determined where does the problem appear to be lodged, then we can go back and design an intervention plan that will match where those problems are. What we want to make sure we're not doing is simply having an intervention in all of these different pathways, because it might not be necessary. And one intervention in the antecedent may actually negate a similar intervention in the consequence. So those are things that have to be taken on board when you're writing a thorough and responsible behavior intervention plan. All right, here's really the part that we're going to discuss in this session. I needed to get you here first, of course. With that said, these steps can be universally applied to lots of different types of problems, right? Not just determining the function of behavior. And they are also applicable to all the variations of an FBA on the continuum, from the interviews all the way to the functional analysis. So we start off with by identifying the problem. We want to pinpoint what's going on. Again, what we want to keep in mind is that that definition that we're going to use encompasses both exemplars and non-exemplars regarding the occurrence or non-occurrence of the behavior. We want to be very specific with the terms we're using. It's not meant to be a global catchphrase that we use for everything that child's doing that's driving us crazy, driving the parents crazy, causing them harm, or whatever the rationale is for why we need to look at the function. All right, when we do this during class time, I typically have you guys engage in trying to operationally define disruption, disrespect, and slowness. And in this case, for Casey, it means speed. It takes too long to get started. So with disruptiveness, you want to keep in mind, how would you define it? What's an example of being disruptive? What's an example of not being disruptive? It's not based on our opinion. It is based on some type of objective, measurable, verifiable behavior that more than one person can look at and then record. So these are terms we use that are descriptors of those behaviors, but in and of themselves, they should not be used to actually define the behavior, because you can't define a behavior with a definition that also requires a definition. What is important to be able to determine is, are we looking at a skill deficit? They have never been taught how to do the skill, or they're missing prerequisites, or a performance deficit. The individual has shown data, has data to show that they perform the skill to a mastery level. However, they don't necessarily do it reliably and under different conditions, all right? That's important, because if it's a skill deficit, that's where all our emphasis wants to be. And really, for the performance deficit, it is about identifying the source of reinforcement. If you get it, but it's just not to the right level, then it's because the reinforcement is not powerful enough. All right, that's kind of what I just said. Not going to belabor the point here. It's an important thing to determine, however. So now we make that determination. We can then go into looking at different ways of collecting data. And the first one would be an indirect assessment. These are checklists or interviews or different types of questions we're asking a caregiver or another service provider, a teacher and a parent, a babysitter, and the daycare worker, and so on. We may also actually get information from the individual or the child themselves. If that child has a way to let us know these things, we want to hear from them. And I think that's really important. We want to look at adults who have direct contact with the child on a regular basis. That might yield information that we have not even thought of up to this point. So I think it's a valuable experience, and you take it for what it is. It's indirect, and it's generally based on opinion. So when you are interviewing people, or when you are determining what questions you're going to ask or what you're going to put on a checklist, you want to think of things like this. In what settings would the person observe the behavior? Are there any settings where the behavior doesn't occur? Who's present when the behavior occurs? What activities or interactions take place just prior to the behavior? And what usually happens immediately after the behavior? So these are the things you want to think about as you're scripting your questions. They very well may be the questions you ask, but they shouldn't be the only questions you ask. This should be really well developed, and I think you could probably get your hands on several documents that are probably used at your site in regards to this. You may see some of this on some more structured types of interviews or checklist or rating scales, such as the Vineland, and some of that might be tremendously helpful. Although the Vineland does provide a score, and it allows you to determine if things are getting better according to the opinion of the stakeholder. But I think there's still some valuable information, even though that sounds, I think, a little suspect. We can extract and glean some valuable information from that. What is critical, however, is that's part of the equation. It is not meant to be all of the equation. Therefore, you're not going to make a hypothesis just based on the responses to your interview questions. Again, this is an indirect assessment. Now we're going to look at direct assessments. And while an FA might be a type of direct assessment, again, we're not talking about that right now. We're talking about a general functional behavior assessment in the middle of the continuum. So all of the parts except manipulating the environment and environmental contingencies. So what we need to be able to accomplish in a direct assessment is observing the problem behavior and then describing or accounting for the conditions that are surrounding the behavior. Just like we saw in the pathways, making sure we are accounting for the antecedent and the consequence. But other things like the setting event, where the antecedent, behavior, and consequence is nested within. And I think that's a really important part of that equation to figure out. All right, so now we're going to kind of look at the behaviors in and of themselves and determine how are we going to actually measure this. We can observe and maybe we're seeing something, but how do we know what to count or how to count it? All right, so what is the dimension of the behavior and what type of vetted accounting system are we going to use to record that? You can't just do whatever you want, all right? So let's start looking at how to analyze things. Generically speaking, we look at how we account for things in the world by determining what is the unit of analysis. So generally speaking, an atom is a unit of analysis of matter. And all of the things we look at from a behavioral perspective, that unit of analysis would be also known as a response class. That is what the response class of the problem behaviors would look like. All of the behaviors that result in contacting the same reinforcement. So now we have a unit of analysis. We're looking at the unit of measurement. How are we going to measure that unit of analysis? With length, minutes, weight, time, so on. So here's one way to make those comparisons. If our unit of analysis is crying, we may operationally define it, of course, and then measure it in the number of minutes. If the unit of analysis is playing blocks, we may look at an interval schedule. Turning in homework event recording, frequency, number of times it occurs. Reading might be about rate. Throwing a ball would be distance traveled, and so on. But this is what's important. You can't measure just any behavior any way. It really has to match. So what this measurement allows us to do is allows us to describe something. We can put it on a visual display. We can then compare things and predict things based on that. So here is one of my favorite flowcharts because I always refer to it whenever I'm in doubt. If we are concerned about the numerical dimension of the behavior and the behavior is discrete, we would use event recording. If the behavior could be continuous, or it's not as discrete, then we would use a type of interval recording, whole or partial, or time sampling. And then if the behavior, if the part of the behavior we're concerned with has to do with the passage of time. So are we talking about latency, the time that has elapsed from antecedent to the time the behavior gets initiated, or how long is it taking for them to actually do it once they've started responding? All right, so that's pretty much it. There's some variations of these, but these are all the main categories. So if you are collecting data in a different way, we need to have a conversation. So if you're collecting learn unit data, it would fall under discrete and event recording. One of the ways we can get information could be through the use of a scatter plot. Again, I have my operational definition. I have determined what it constitutes and what it doesn't constitute. I'm pretty good at being able to mark down that it's happening. But we might want to know some other pieces of info. So if we look at this 40-minute time period across the week, I can come up with a way to scatter plot whether the behavior has occurred. So you would need, to a certain degree, an event recording, okay, whether it is about, it occurred once or multiple times, but you could also plug this into any of the other types of recordings: interval, time sampling, duration, latency. So the scatter plot is pretty useful. Again, you can't make decisions from it, but it can contribute to the bigger picture in order to help you make decisions. Because there's some pieces missing from this, like what's the source of reinforcement, what happened before, but we know about time. If we know about time, we could actually then determine, generally speaking, what's happening during that time on this day of the week. So by looking at this, maybe what I've decided to use as a coding would be, if the behavior occurs maybe 3 times or less, I would put a slash. If the behavior occurs more than 3 times, I would darken the entire interval. An easier way to do it could be, if it happened at all in the interval, I'll put a slash. If it happened the whole time, I'd darken it. And this is how you may actually represent some of your interval data, partial or whole, because that's what it's telling us here. So by analyzing just this scatter plot, what I can tell is, looks like the 9:25 hour, we definitely have a problem there, because, or the 9:25 minute mark within the hour, we definitely have a problem there because it's occurred every day of the week. Next, the second runner-up or whatever would be 9:15 and 9:20, and those are kind of flip-flopped images. We also see that at 9:10, it's occurred throughout the week, but it occurred more predominantly at the beginning of the week. So lots of good info can be gleaned here. I can then go back and look at what's going on at those time periods to take further additional data that may be more helpful in determining a function. All right, I don't think I have to school you guys in event recording, but we're just counting discrete events as they occur. You should have a definite beginning and a definite end. That's not what I want. Okay, and then subsequently you would label your y-axis on your graph to be able to reflect what it is that you're measuring. Those two always have to match up. And then your x-axis, of course, is really important. Is it instructional settings? And they have 3 of those a day. Is it the school day? Is it one clinical day? And so on. You have to be able to define that. All right, I think this is self-explanatory. We won't really get into that. So what's important is that we want to be able to observe, verify, measure. Then we want to take what we're doing with that and then graph it, because the graph is going to help us interpret some things. We can know nothing about this at all, but know that in interval 7, we have a problem here across every day of the week. That's really important to be able to figure that out, because we may need a global intervention that's occurring at that time. We need a lot of bang for our buck at that time. Data can also help us establish a trend. Even when maybe that trend is a no trend, we can still get a lot of good information from looking at trends and determining, is our intervention making things better or worse over time. And we want data on the actual intervention itself, not just the outcome from the intervention. Because we, in a situation like timeout, we may want to know, well, he's staying in timeout for longer periods of time, and that's why he or she's not having a problem in the classroom, because we've cut their classroom minutes by 70% or something to that effect. All right, so we have both direct and indirect assessments that we're putting together, and that information should allow us to formulate some type of hypothesis. First, we have to analyze the data. So we need to look at the data, compare and contrast the data to before, during, and after, what we're trying to identify. Look for patterns in the data. Sometimes those data have cyclical patterns in them. That's going to send us to a place where we can start investigating even further. And then we revise anything about our assessment that might have been in place prior to that, based on that analysis. That allows us to revisit the hypothesis at that point. With that said, we have to use the data. Again, I want to reiterate this, to generate the hypothesis. And that hypothesis will state something in regards to function. And I need to be able to see that clearly when you're doing this. I don't want to try to scratch my head and figure out, how did you come up with the function? I want to be able to see that pathway, and that's telling me that you are quite well versed in maybe not getting it right, but the rationale is in place. All right, and obviously we can, once we have a hypothesis, there's something we can test. So Darryl talks a lot aloud during class time. We did an FBA because it might reveal the function. And what we find is that it's both attention maintained and to avoid a low interest subject. That's critical because we may have to have two interventions that play off of both of these sources of reinforcement. Then we take that information, put it all together, and that drives the behavior intervention plan. One thing that we look for here in the course is a connection between your intervention plan and the FBA, which really aligns to what I talk to you guys about quite frequently regarding how the principle and the tactic have to match. Very much a good analogy and very much the same thing that really needs to happen here. So this is where we're going to stop the session for this evening. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please email myself or Dr. Shanman directly. These things are always so much easier to do when we have a class here attending, because I can look at people's faces and gather information regarding whether they're picking it up or not. Don't have that luxury under these conditions, but we're just making do with the best we can. So I appreciate your time, and I look forward to working with you soon.